This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Eve Engler. Today we're going to discuss a 50-year anniversary of the fall of Saigon, which is coming up this week, with Vietnam being reunited after decades of resistance against French colonialism and US imperialism. According to the liberal nationalist mythology, Canada didn't participate in the US war in Vietnam that left millions dead. This isn't true. To discuss this history, we have John Boyko, who is author of the book The Devil's Trick: How Canada Fought the Vietnam War. First of all, thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy, John. And can you, give us maybe a little bit of an overview of Canada's roots in Vietnam and maybe a bit of its support for the French in the 1950s, and then kind of move us along towards the U.S. Involvement?
Well, Canada was involved in the American era of the Vietnam War, and I'm glad you brought the French into it because the French had been a colonial power in what they called French Indochina for 350 years. And so the Canadians had been supporting that because of the resources and products that they needed from that area, from that era. In 1954, when the French finally decided that it was time to leave, late 1953, a conference was held in Geneva at which the major powers, France and Britain, the United States, China, and Russia, got together with the people of Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia sitting against the wall and not invited to participate. And that's when they decided that they would temporarily divide the country at the 17th parallel, and they would temporarily allow Ho Chi Minh to rule the North and Diem to rule the South until elections were held a year later. But they needed someone to basically make sure that all of the rules of the agreement that they had come to in Geneva were followed. That is, that the French left with all of their equipment and all their military equipment and personnel. And anybody wanted to go north could go south. Anybody wanted to south could go north. And that the sides, because it was not only an imperial war against the French, it was also a civil war within Vietnam, that basically everybody played nice and stopped shooting while this year of transition took place. And those at Geneva decided that they were going to set up three countries basically to oversee it. And one was going to be India because it was neutral in the Cold War. And a second was going to be Poland because it was going to be the communist representative. And third would be Canada. They originally were going to talk about Belgium, but Belgium had a history of imperialism and colonialism as well, and Canada did not. So there was a respect for Canada at the time, and Canada was chosen. Well, we put together, as part of this group called the International Control Commission, about 350, it varied year to year, about 350 or so diplomats and soldiers, originally under the leadership of a brigadier general called Sherwood Lett, and we oversaw that year. But the ICC and Canada's role in it with the three countries stayed right until the end of the conflict in 1973, and even after the Americans, the left after the Nixon-Kissinger deal. So Canada was there right from the beginning, and we were there throughout in a number of ways throughout the American session of the Vietnam War.
Well, there was also Canadian weapons that were sent to the French with the NATO Mutual Assistance Program in the 1950, and you have comments of Lester Pearson as external minister who was very supportive of French policy in the early 1950s while they were, repressing the anti-colonial kind of movement. But as you mentioned, it's really important, not very well known Canadian role as the West's representative on the International Control Commission. Noam Chomsky has referred to Lester Pearson as a war criminal for his role in delivering U.S. Bombing threats to the North. That all came out in the Pentagon Papers, and it was Johnson asked Canada if it would ask Pearson if Canada would do that through its role in the ICC, which it apparently did do. And the Americans, of course, bombed North Vietnam, and estimates are 100,000 or so were killed. And so for that reason, Noam Chomsky famously on CBC told Peter Gosky that it was a war criminal airport that he arrived in Toronto, which prompted quite a kerfuffle. But yeah, so the Canada had a role through the ICC in terms of there's spying on the North for the Americans and other things like that. But also, can you maybe go further with like there's other elements of Canada's kind of contribution in terms of all these Canadians that fought. La Presse, a couple days ago over the weekend, it did this report on this sort of grouping of Quebecois who fought in Vietnam. And yes, what do we know about the Canadians who fought in Vietnam with the Americans?
Well, I'd like to talk about that. I'd go back just what you were talking about. Yeah, Blair Seaborn was the Canadian that was chosen by Pearson after he met with Johnson at a New York hotel. And Johnson told him, here's what I would like you to take to the Vietnamese, because Johnson said at that point, whether he was sincere or not, that he wanted to get the Americans out. That's before the invasion at Da Nang and the Americans were truly in. Of course, there was like 15,000 American advisors in there, and it was very much a war already. But before they escalated it, Blair Seaborn took that message, met with the North Vietnamese prime minister, and said everything that Johnson wanted him to say, that Pearson wanted him to say. And that is that if you do not basically stop this civil war, if you do not allow the South to continue, then we will bomb your cities and we will attack you. That was the threat. I met Blair Seaborn, met with him in Ottawa. Only about 6 months before he died. He was still very much able to recall what had happened and told me incredible stories about what happened. And when I mentioned what you had said about the Chomsky accusation of him being a spy, he became quite agitated. And he said, I was not a spy. I was a diplomat. A spy is someone who works behind the scenes and no one knows what they're doing. He said, they knew what we were doing. I met with their leader. That's not something that a spy would do. He was an intermediary with the American government. So it is really interesting because while we are talking nuance and things that aren't known by a great number of people, that he was very much still defending what he had done.
But I
It's
mean,
interesting.
but
Now, yeah, the other question. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, just the sort of the question, delivering threats of bombing that then transpire. I think that violates international law. So you're delivering American threats. That I think that's where Chomsky would say the war criminal side. Whether that seems to me that seems like somewhat of a small element of Canada's overarching picture in Vietnam. But I think by the legalese of it, you can't be delivering another country's bombing threats, and which then transpire. But
Oh, I'm not defending what was done. I am telling you Blair Seaborn's opinion of what was done because he was the man who was doing it. One of the things that Blair Seaborn did is he wrote a long report, which are in the archives, and I read it, and he talked about it when I met him in Ottawa. And he told Pearson, through Pearson Johnson, take the deal that the North Vietnamese are giving you, because he spent a great deal of time, a number of days afterward, traveling through Hanoi, speaking to military people, speaking to business people, talking to ordinary people in the street. And he reported back, you will lose. He said through Pearson to Johnson, you can bomb every city for as long as you want to bomb. You can attack. You can, and he basically anticipated. He said, you can mine their harbors. You can do this. You can do this. You will never win. They will outlast you just like they outlasted the French. So I recommend that you do not escalate. I recommend that you leave immediately. So that's an interesting angle to that as well. So the other question that you asked was about Canada's involvement with respect to people that were there. There were a number of people that were there. I read the art in the McMaster University. There's the papers of Claire Culhane, and Claire Culhane was a hospital administrator in Montreal, 48 years old, who read in a weekend magazine in the Montreal Star that there were 5 Canadian hospitals in Vietnam, paid for by the Canadian government and staffed by Canadian doctors and nurses. And she volunteered with External Affairs and she went there, and she was there supposed to be there for a year. She lasted 6 months. It wasn't the horror that got her to leave after 6 months, although it was quite horrible. It was the hypocrisy, because what she found was almost all of the people that were being taken care of in this hospital and the other four hospitals were victims of American bombing attacks and raids on villages, and especially around the area where she was, right up near the 17th parallel on the coast, on the East Coast. And what she also found was that her meticulous records were being taken every Friday night by the Canadian doctor who was the director of the hospital and given to the American CIA as part of their Phoenix program so that they could use that information to go to villages to pick up people who were suspected of being Viet Cong or Viet Cong sympathizers, and they were questioned or they were tortured or they were kidnapped or they were murdered. She discovered that was happening and she said, I'm sorry, I'm out. So, yes, another way that Canada was involved was through the about, and it's hard to get a number, about 30,000 people who signed up and went. I interviewed a number of people for The Devil's Trick who were Canadians who signed up with the American forces and served. One of them was named Doug Carey, lives near Ottawa at Carleton Place. And I asked him, why would you go? I asked them all, why would you do that? You were an 18-year-old kid living in Oakville with your grandmother. Why would you leave and join the American Marines? And he said what they all said. It's one of three reasons. One, we were told throughout our entire lives, he said, and that we need to fight communism because communism is going to take over the world and we need to stop it. The domino theory was believed by everybody from the public that were told to believe it to the military and political leaders that were basing decisions upon it. That is, if Vietnam fell, then next would fall Cambodia and Laos and the Philippines and Japan, and we have to stop them there. So that is the reason that one of the reasons that a number of people went. The Canadian Chief Defense Staff at that time, his son signed up for the American military and died in Vietnam. And when asked, do you regret your son going? He said, no, I'm proud because we have to fight communists where they are. So that was one reason. The second is Doug Carey told me, and this was the reason he did it, is because when they were growing up, this generation of young men, everybody, almost every male was, and many female were veterans, whether fathers, uncles, doctors, their teachers, the mechanic, their barber, they were veterans of the Second World War, Korean War. And therefore, they saw it as a ticket to manhood and adulthood that you serve. But the Canadian military at the time was going through some interesting times and where they were uniting the services into one, making it unpopular, and they weren't at war with anyone at the time where the Americans you could serve and actually fight in combat. And the third reason, and I talked to a gentleman who said, yeah, that's why I went, is because women like a guy in uniform and I'll come home and get the girls. And I guess there's been 19-year-olds using that reason to join the military forever. So, but those were the reasons why about 30,000 Canadians fought in Vietnam. There are about, and again, it's tough because citizenship is tough to register if they stayed in the United States or if they, whatever, but about 169 Canadians are on the Vietnam Wall.
Which I think was actually more than Canadians that were killed in Afghanistan, I believe. I think it's around 150, 155, and that kind
That's
of.
right. And
Uh,
yet, when they came back, they weren't accepted as veterans. We know all of the stories, and they're not apocryphal of the reception that the soldiers got when they returned home. And the Canadians came home to that same reception, but at the same time, their government did not recognize them as having served. They were simply foreign mercenaries. They weren't even allowed to join the Legion. They weren't allowed to lay a wreath at Remembrance Day. And there was no memorial built for years and years. And they got no help with the PTSD that a great many of them came back, just like the American veterans came back. So they served in the same way as the American young people served, but they got none of the help and support, which was, we know, lacking in the United States, but even more so in Canada.
And so also there were lots of Canadian weapons. It was quite a controversial issue with the anti-war movement in the late 60s and the 70s. Different universities that assisted the US, Pentagon and whatever weapons research. And also there was different Canadian bases, Agent Orange tested and stuff like that. Can you talk a little bit about that side of Canada's support?
Yeah, Claire Culhane that I mentioned before, she came back from working at the hospital and she became a force of nature. She wrote a long report to External Affairs and saying, how dare Canada, this was the hypocrisy that I was mentioning, how dare Canada send all of that money in foreign aid to South Vietnam while we claim to be neutral in the war? And we are part of the ICC, which is supposed to be neutral, but we don't build any hospitals in North Vietnam, only in South Vietnam. And how can we build hospitals to help the people of South Vietnam? And at the same time, we are providing weapons to the Americans that they then use to fill up those hospitals. So that was the hypocrisy that Claire Culhane was talking about. Yeah, Agent Orange was built in Canada. Napalm was built in Canada. Guidance systems were built in Canada. Everything from the iconic green berets that the Marines wore were made in Winnipeg. In Gagetown, which is still a military base in New Brunswick, they tested Agent Orange in planes that went over and dropped it and to see if the defoliant would work and it obviously did. But what it also did is what it was then going to do to the North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese that it was used on. And it poisoned water. It poisoned, put toxics in the food, and the cancer rates around Gagetown exploded and exploded for generations. And there are people who have been fighting for recognition from the Canadian government for generations to try to get recognition for what was done to them without their knowledge, let alone consent. So yeah, at one point, Claire Culhane did a 10-day fast right outside Parliament Hill. And she was visited by a number of MPs. A 29-year-old Ed Broadbent came out and gave support for her. She was supported by the Voice of Women, which was the first national anti-Vietnam War organization. And Jean Marchand, if you recall, one of the three wise men that came with Pierre Trudeau, and he was a very powerful minister, had the ear of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. And he came out and they had a discussion, which turned into a debate, which turned into a shouting match. And he said, do you want to tell the 35,000 Canadian workers who are supplying weaponry to the United States that they are out of work because we no longer want to support the Vietnam War with our factories and with our weaponry? And she said, I would gladly tell them. The money that was made every year was the equivalent, if we take it to Canadian dollars, of about $1.2 billion. And we talked about Pearson earlier, but now that is continuing into the Trudeau government, and they simply decided that they would take profit over principle.
Are there any other elements that are in your book that you think are worth discussing in terms of the history of, obviously it's a full book and probably go on for hours, but other highlights that people would be interested in knowing or
Well, what I found interesting is whenever I begin a book, I think that I'm arrogant enough to think I know this. Now I just have to put it together, and then I'm always every time surprised by the things that I learn as I dig and I dig and I dig. One of the things that I learned is that while we know that about 30,000 or so Canadians went south to fight with the Americans in the war. At the same time, about the same number, some people say it's 30, some people say 40,000 young Americans were heading north as draft dodgers, they called them, basically people who were trying to get away from having to fight the war. And I always was under the illusion that we Canadians are so great to have welcomed them in and to accepted them as Canadians, because almost all of them stayed, even after Jimmy Carter in his second day of office did an amnesty, not for the deserters, but for those who left before they had actually joined. And they expected they would all come rushing back to the United States, and hardly any of them did. I expected to find that we welcomed them. But the polling at the time, from 1965, when they really began to come over in great numbers, all the way to the end of the war, say 1972, the vast majority, different in different parts of the country, but always the majority of Canadians did not want them here. There were a great number of organizations that were built in a number of cities, in Toronto, in Vancouver, in Montreal, and then little towns across Canada, to help them arrive and to find housing and find jobs and just help them to adjust. And a lot of these were organized by universities, and a lot of them were organized by churches. What was really interesting in the churches, a number of Catholic and Presbyterian Protestant churches did polling as well within their churches to see, should we continue to do this? Should we continue to support this, to give them money and to give them logistical help, places to be in church basements and things like that to organize? And they found that the vast majority of the ministers, the priests, believed that this was a good thing to support them. The vast majority of the people in the pews did not want them. So I found that that was interesting. And it was the same thing when, after the war was over, and the first wave of immigrants and leaving Vietnam when the North took it over. And then the second wave, that weren't the people with money that could get on planes, had to somehow get on boats and try to find their way here. The vast majority of Canadians then in the polls did not want them here either. So I found it interesting that while we sometimes pat ourselves on the back as, oh, those Americans, they were doing such nasty things in Vietnam. Well, we were right up to our eyeballs in it. And we pat ourselves in the back by saying, oh, but we were so good. We took the draft dodgers and we took the refugees, the boat people afterward. Yeah, but most of us at the time didn't want either. So I think it's important that when we look at ourselves, we look at ourselves clearly rather than with the myths that we've created about ourselves.
Agree completely. The book is The Devil's Trick: How Canada Fought the Vietnam War. Thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy, John.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I appreciate it.